Well, thank you all for joining us. We are the Society of Professional Journalists International Community. We aim to, with our IC Talk series, to connect journalists from around the world when at a time it was really difficult to do so. And in this new year of our IC Talks, we're aiming to do a more condensed conversation of updates with journalists from around the world. And today I'm really excited to talk with our SPJ Rio Grande chapter. They recently had an initiative that really captured our attention for their support of journalists in Myanmar. So we're looking forward to talking to them more about that today. Our guests are Jerry Redfern and Karen Coates. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
So Jerry and Karen, I'd love to start by asking, what got the local chapter to get involved in this initiative? What was the beginning steps of the thought process of thinking maybe we should do something about what's going on in Myanmar?
So I don't know if you want to start or.
Well, the basic initiative of it was Karen says we should do something for our friends in Myanmar because we have lots of journalist contacts there. And then the idea came up with we should raise money. And then the idea came up, well, we should just ask SPJ to do it and see if we could bring it up that way. I mean, that's the very basic thumbnail sketch of the whole thing.
So a little background, Jerry is currently on the board of the local chapter. I no longer am, but I had been for several years and I'm the past president. And the two of us were married. We have spent a large portion of our working lives in Southeast Asia. We used to live in Southeast Asia. We've done a lot of work with journalists in Myanmar and journalists from Myanmar outside of the country, and done a lot of journalism trainings in past years. And that's why we have so many journalism friends there right now. And you know, when this happened in February, I thought this is just horrifying for so many people we know.
And how was the approach when you thought about putting this initiative together? Why is it so important for local chapter to be aware of what's going on in Myanmar? Where's that connection of why they should care?
Well, that's kind of an interesting question. I guess that for me and Karen, I don't think it's ever been a question particularly. We're just interested in these things. I mean, as Karen noted, we've spent the majority of our professional life working overseas, particularly in Asia. So to us, it seems like a natural extension to help out at a time like this. I also think, as Dan brought up when we were talking beforehand, that there are these international connections that are not as distant as people like to think. You know, a really interesting thing is, say, that the companies even in a place like New Mexico that have work and relations that go on in a place like Myanmar. So one of the biggest companies working in New Mexico is Chevron, the big multinational oil corporation. They also have very large operations in Myanmar. And that might seem, you know, somewhat nebulous, but it's an idea of the sort of all of these contacts that happen, whether we recognize them or not, between other countries and our own, and, you know, other countries in our own local journalism community even.
I also think that, you know, as a reporter, when I look at the issues that I cover, whether we're talking about the environment, climate change, human rights, gender equity, those sorts of things, health, the pandemic, even though our chapter is focused locally, and even though we spend a lot of time talking about local journalism, all of these issues are global. We don't live in a silo. We don't, you know, we might live in New Mexico, but the issues around us, the biggest issues in the state, are all really global issues. And so I've personally tried to do, you know, something to sort of broaden that awareness.
So what's been the feedback from the journalism community within your chapter, or just in the local? I mean, I'm sure the local community was aware of what you guys were doing. What was that feedback and reception to the initiative you guys started?
I think in like the American sense, it was very positive because we got a lot of money.
That's great.
And I was actually, this is no knock against my fellow board members, but I was actually very happily surprised by how quickly everybody just said, yes, let's do this immediately. When I brought it up at a meeting a few months back, it was like no discussion. I laid the idea out that, we have contacts, we can probably figure out a way to get money to help journalists in Myanmar. We knew that there was a need for it. And within like 3 minutes, the whole thing had been brought up, a vote was taken, and it was decided, do it, figure it out and let us know. So, and from, then on, we've had nothing but remarkably positive feedback.
Oh, that's wonderful. And I know you mentioned earlier that you were in that region before, and I'm curious, how were you able to, especially now, what was happening in Myanmar, the restrictions via social media, people not having access to seeing what was actually happening, just it's so important to have that reporting happening, especially at that time of when there are those restrictions. How were you able to connect with the locals and maintain those contacts and vet that?
So all of this really stems from connections that we had already with friends through Facebook and things like Signal. And when the coup happens, I connected with a colleague who had lived there for many years. And she's American, but she lived there for 9 years. And she was already part of an existing group of people working more broadly to help the protesters and more broadly across the population. And then we sort of got together and thought, okay, well, let's start something for journalists specifically. And that then spiraled into, a much larger group of both journalists and NGOs around the world who wanted to help. And, I can't say exactly how we continue to communicate, and it does change depending on the situation. But there are ways. There are definitely ways to keep in touch. Sometimes there are blackouts or you don't hear from people for a while, but there are ways.
Yeah. And from your experience with this and just your previous history, just being in the region and knowing it so well, what can you let journalists or just the audience know about what's the current situation in Myanmar, especially for journalists? What's being missed that we're probably not seeing in mainstream media?
It's so bad. I mean, I don't even really know how to describe how bad it is. And I think that like the constant overwhelming fear and pressure that people are experiencing every minute. The friends we have there are moving around from night to night, sleeping on people's floors, just, trying to stay under covers, trying not to get arrested. People's lives have been completely disrupted. Others who used to work in journalism no longer are. Their families are selling snacks on the street side as a way to make money, anything to survive. Just going outside, going down the block can be the end of your life. I mean, this is how bad the violence is, that people cannot even walk outside of their homes without the fear of being shot. And this is for all civilians, everyone.
Yeah, I think another important fact too is that the usual past relief valve of the Thai border has essentially closed. Used to be if you had real big problems with the government and you hadn't been arrested yet, you could essentially run to the border, cross the river, and you were in Thailand. And there were networks of people who could help you out there. There were essentially refugee camp cities that you could live in. I mean, there were options for actually leaving the country. And because of, I would say, the current Thai government, and also because of COVID-19 restrictions on travel and the current uptick in COVID cases there at this point, they've really shut the border. So people are in a way trapped in the country unless they have huge amounts of money to be able to fly out.
But even the government now is checking people on flights out.
Right. So it's become very, very difficult.
I'd love to get your take on, so there was a story that was done by CNN with Clarissa Ward. There was lots of criticism about it. Do you have a reaction to that report and just kind of your take on what that situation was, and what was your reaction to the story done by Clarissa and CNN in general? Was it pretty accurate, you think?
I my first reaction was, how can anyone go there and report without thinking that anybody they talk to is going to suffer the consequences afterward? I mean, she seemed surprised, but that is the way it is. That is the way it has been in the past. It's not about you as the foreign reporter. It's about every person you talk to. I do know people in Myanmar who were not thoroughly upset by her presence and her reporting. It's not, I don't really feel like it's my place to judge that, but being a foreigner going to Myanmar, going to other countries, that's always been forefront in my mind, thinking, what happens to this person if I talk to this person, even if this person wants to talk? I think that has to be huge in your mind.
For sure. You know, I'm sure we have lots of journalists within our community that are, just starting their careers. And a lot of times they ask, yeah, how can I become a foreign correspondent? Or what are the tips that you guys have? And I'm curious to see what tips would you have for an up and coming journalist, or someone, or a journalist that would like to cover this subject matter, but do it in a safe way? What are some tips that you would have that would be helpful on how to cover Myanmar?
Covering it now.
Yeah, I'm not sure if you haven't been there at this point, that there's a way that you could safely go in there to try to cover anything at this point. I mean, you're essentially walking into a war zone. And if you don't already know it, it's going to be very difficult to logistically do anything of any note. Far be it for me to tell somebody not to go do some reporting, but I think that would not be the place to start.
Maybe starting in Thailand or India, or a place where refugees are going to. There are many going to India as well. Yeah, I think it would be extremely difficult to just jump into this story if you don't have a background covering the country at this point. But sort of going around the outskirts and then meeting people and spending a lot of time. It's not a story that you can just, fly in and fly out and do.
Right. And one thing that we always ask our guests in our talk series is, what does press freedom mean to you? So I'd like to ask both of you, what does press freedom mean to you?
That's an interesting question.
Well, let me answer that in a way that relates specifically to this situation. It means that my friends in Myanmar don't have to live in fear, that they don't have to think that they might die the next day, or that they might not have enough to eat the next day, simply because they're doing their jobs. And this is a huge part of the reason why, as being part of the SPJ chapter here, I wanted to try to bring in international connections and promote international events and projects and programs, because they might be thousands of miles away in Myanmar, or pick any other country where there's a strife at this point. But we are all journalists, and we are all working in the same field and the same job with pretty much the same goals. And I think it's important for us to understand what is happening in places like Myanmar, where there is no press freedom, there is no security, because I think it's easy at times to be in this country as an American working on American issues for American publications without really internalizing, okay, what does this mean? what does it mean that I can go out my door in the morning or, in non-pandemic times and just go right up to people and interview people without being afraid that I'm going to be shot in the street? And
Right.
What she
Jerry?
said. I agree with that.
Yeah. Did you want to add anything to that, Jerry, or are you going with ditto?
I think I'll probably stick with ditto. She's better with the words like that. So,
Well, is there anything that you would like to add that we haven't discussed that you think is important to bring up? I know we're towards the end of our conversation. I went by really fast, but is there anything that you'd like to share with the community in regards to the project, Myanmar, or just in general, the SPJ Rio Grande chapter?
If people are still interested in joining and donating, that's still open. If you go to, what's the website, spjriogrande.org, you can find, I think it's right up front on the page there, and you could donate if you still want to do that. We still have ways of getting money into the country and getting it to journalists, so that's still going. And also, don't be afraid of doing this stuff in your own local chapter. There are all sorts of international journalism groups out there that are only too happy to join up and work with you and talk with you and do things. It's fascinating and it's fantastic.
Wonderful.
And I just want to thank SPJ and to thank you for highlighting this and, helping to get the word out about this issue in particular, but all international issues and those sorts of connections that can be made, globally and locally.
Right. Well, thank you guys for doing this, because I think it's so important for people to realize that press freedom issues around the world, there's an issue outside of our borders. And whether we like it or not, it really relates to us in a very local way. And we have to be aware of that. And we have to be a part of the solution, or a part of something that can help our colleagues abroad. So I commend you guys for doing this. And also, I want to piggyback off of what you just said is, do you have any tips of how maybe local journalists or local SPJ chapters, whatever it may be, if they want to start an initiative like that, what would be like your top points or top 3 bullet points of how to get this ball rolling?
I guess, having said that, an initiative like this, you have to know people in the first place, because that's kind of what allows it to happen. So I think it's sort of like the idea of planting a tree. What's the best time to plant a tree? Well, 20 years ago. What's the next best time to plant a tree? It's today. And
right.
I think that perhaps there are all sorts of international training programs out there, or exchange programs, say through IREX or other groups, that help American journalists meet journalists from other countries, either in their country or over here. And Karen and I have done lots of programs with groups like that in years past. And that's kind of how we stay in touch with a lot of people. And I think that a lot of newsrooms are unwilling to take on doing that sort of thing, because they don't think they have the time. They don't think there's really anything parallel. What are we really going to get out of this? But it's the kind of partnership where you don't know what sort of dividend it's going to pay until you sort of follow through with it and see what the possibilities are, because you don't know what the possibilities are until you begin, I think. So that's my long-winded pitch to get in touch with these sorts of international journalism groups that put journalists together here and abroad. And I think that's probably the place to start. I don't know, you have other thoughts?
No, yeah, I totally agree.
Oh, wonderful. Well, sure. Did you want to add something, Karen, or?
No, I just, as Jerry was saying, that there are so many opportunities out there. I think in a local community, events come up, there are talks, there are visiting scholars, programs, things that come into your community. Well, if something's going on, check it out, just start meeting people and see where those connections lead.
Wonderful. Well, I thank you guys for joining us today. I know it went by so fast, and I'm looking forward to staying tuned of the progress you guys are having with the initiative that you guys started. And I hope that we can connect with you and see how that's going with you guys and the chapter. If there's anything else that does come up, please do let us know. we'll be sure to get that link from you on how to support your initiative with the Myanmar journalists and share that with our community. Thank you. And we look forward to staying in touch.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you. This was great.
Thank you.